The story we've been told is full of shadows that are rarely illuminated. We were led to believe that the Allies were the heroes, the bearers of justice and freedom, while Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese embodied absolute evil. But reality, as always, is darker and more complex. The victors, once victory was in their grasp, showed a side that many prefer to forget. The repression that followed the fall of Germany was brutal, merciless, as if triumph had given them license to act without limits. Not content with the defeat of their enemies, they wanted to leave an indelible mark, a lesson written in blood and fire. Dresden, known as the Florence of the Elbe, was one of the most tragic victims of this thirst for destruction. In February 1945, when the war was already decided, the Allies launched a rain of bombs on the city, reducing it to rubble. It was not an act of military strategy, but a demonstration of power, a disproportionate punishment that devastated architectural gems and thousands of innocent lives. The streets, once full of life, became a hell of fire and smoke. Not a single building remained standing, only the deathly silence and the echo of the explosions that continued to reverberate in every corner. But this was not the end. In August 1945, the Americans, under the banner of democracy, dropped 2 atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 2 cities of no military significance, 2 acts of mass destruction that claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. The justification was the end of the war, but the cost was an indelible stain on human history. And as the bombs fell, the Allied troops advanced. With them came pillage, violence, and abuse. Mass rape became a daily reality, especially at the hands of the Soviets, but also the French and Americans. Women, girls, even the elderly, fell victim to a brutality that made no distinction between the innocent and the guilty. The war, supposedly waged in the name of freedom, became an excuse for horror. In Germany, the end of the war was a slow agony. At the end of 1942, rumors of defeat at Stalingrad began to spread. For a population accustomed to victories, the idea of the mighty Sixth Army being encircled was difficult to accept. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, tried to maintain morale with messages of austerity and determination, but the reality was increasingly grim. By Christmas 1944, Berlin was no longer the city many had known. Bombing had reduced much of the capital to rubble, and the exhausted and starving people resorted to macabre humor to survive. "Be practical, give a coffin," went a popular joke. Air raid shelters, illuminated with blue lights and luminous paint, became temporary homes for a population that spent more time underground than in their own beds. Fear of invaders from the east was palpable, fueled by stories of atrocities such as those in Nemmersdorf, where Soviet troops had raped and murdered hundreds of civilians. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 gave a brief respite to German morale, but it was only a mirage. Hitler, obsessed with turning the tide of the war, ignored his generals' warnings about the danger on the Eastern Front. On January 13, 1945, General Ivan Chukov launched a massive offensive in East Prussia. Soviet troops, motivated by revenge, advanced with unrelenting ferocity. To them, it was the den of the fascist beast, and they acted accordingly. Erich Koch, the Nazi leader in East Prussia, fled, leaving the population in chaos. The Soviets, shocked by the wealth in German homes, looted and destroyed in jealous rage. Rape and murder became routine, and commanders, though they tried to control their troops, could do little. Between January and February 1945, nearly 8.5 million Germans fled their homes. East Prussia, a symbol of German culture, was devastated. In every village, the horrors of war were evident. For the Soviets, the war had simply moved to German soil. What they had suffered in the USSR was now inflicted on Germany. The line between victims and executioners blurred, and the cycle of violence continued, leaving a trail of destruction and pain that still resonates in the memories of those who lived through it. Berlin in the crosshairs. By late January, Berlin was sinking into an abyss of despair. Air raid sirens blared relentlessly, and refugees with blank stares murmured chilling stories about the Red Army. Hungary, formerly an ally of Germany, had shifted its allegiance to the USSR. Rumors about the collapse of the Eastern Front spread like poison, and railway workers, their ears pressed to the rails, knew more about the enemy advance than the High Command. Many Germans, in the darkness of their homes, secretly tuned in to the BBC, searching for a truth their own government denied them. Some still harbored a faint hope that the Soviets were only hunting officers and members of the SS. Public transportation continued to operate, but sleeping close to work had become a necessity. Berliners, with tired faces, opened their doors to relatives whose homes had been reduced to rubble. Those with influence tried to escape the capital, but Goebbels's words resounded like a judgment. Leaving Berlin without permission was treason. The executions, ordered by Himmler on January 23rd, multiplied. Members of the resistance linked to the July plot fell one after another. Goebbels' motto, "We will win because we must win," rang hollow, unable to hide the fear that gnawed at the men. Hitler, barely seen, seemed a ghost of his former self. Officers who visited him at the Reich Chancellery noticed how his once imposing figure faded into shadow. He distrusted everyone, even those closest to him. Meanwhile, the First Ukrainian Front, under the command of Marshal Ivan Konev, advanced relentlessly, taking key cities. The German 17th Army fled towards the Oder River, pursued by the echoes of Soviet tanks. Meanwhile, the First Belarusian Front, led by Marshal Georgy Zhukov, was approaching Berlin with terrifying speed. Stalin had ordered Zhukov to wait, but the impatient man decided to press on. His troops crossed the Wand almost without resistance, while the Poles' desire for revenge burned fiercely. German civilians, caught in the crossfire, suffered the brunt of the Soviet forces. On February 23rd, Poznan fell under the weight of the tanks, bringing the battle closer to Berlin. Soviet troops reached the Oder River, establishing bridgeheads near Kustrin. The Germans, surprised by the speed of the advance, had no time to organize a solid defense. The clock was ticking against Berlin. On April 20th, 1945, Adolf Hitler's 56th birthday, fireworks were set off by the artillerymen of the First Belarusian Front. That same day, the relentless bombardment of Berlin began, which would not cease until the city fell 3 days later. A Soviet newspaper announced that its soldiers were already on the streets of Berlin. That morning, the Nazis declared that Hitler would stay in the city, giving the battle symbolic significance for Europe. But for civilians, ideologies had lost meaning. Only survival mattered. One of the largest shelters was the bunker in Anhalter, Bahnhof, near the main station. A steel and concrete structure with walls 4.5 meters thick, it housed thousands of people in inhumane conditions. Up to 12,000 people were crammed into 3,600 square meters, so densely that moving was impossible. One woman spent 6 days on the same step, unable to reach the restroom. Hygiene became a luxury and clean water an obsession. A pump outside the station was the only source, and young women risked their lives to get it. Those who returned were seen as heroes by those too weak or scared to try. Morale among German soldiers crumbled. Even the bravest seemed consumed by fear. Many officers and men hid under civilian clothes, and desertion became common. Young soldiers, desperate to lose their virginity, sought solace in girls who, fearing rape by the Soviets, preferred to surrender to the Germans first. The chaos led to increased sexual activity in basements and bunkers. A Norwegian journalist observed young men in uniform giving in to their urges in a frantic search for pleasure, though this did not hide the women's fear of rape. Looting became a necessity. Gerda Peterson, a young secretary, joined a group of women who looted a ration wagon. When Russian planes attacked, Gerda took shelter under a wagon and watched a woman carrying toilet paper die, reflecting on the absurdity of her end. With the electricity cut off, rumors became the only source of news. Nazi propaganda, which called for resistance to the death, was replaced by Soviet leaflets urging German soldiers to surrender. Many did so, showing the leaflets to their captors. Soviet propagandists also sent messages to the women of Berlin, promising them safety if they persuaded the soldiers to surrender. But the future looked bleak, especially for women and young people who lived under the constant shadow of rape. Commanding the defense of Berlin was General Helmuth Weidling, with some 45,000 men, including the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Volkssturm, poorly trained and ill-equipped. They faced 1.5 million Soviet soldiers. As the Soviets advanced, the defenders fought ferociously, but they were outnumbered. Hitler, in his bunker, raved about a twist of fate. One of his last orders was to destroy the city's infrastructure, including bridges and food supplies. The subway stations flooded, drowning thousands of civilians seeking shelter. Berlin, once a proud city, was crumbling. Buildings were mountains of rubble, and the streets were an open-air cemetery. The last defenses of the German soldiers were valiant but futile. On the morning of May 2nd, Soviet troops captured the Reich Chancellery, and the red flag of the Soviet Union was raised above the Reichstag. The fall of Berlin marked the end of the Third Reich and was a moment of immense joy for Soviet soldiers, although for Berliners the future was a shadowy mystery. End of the war. The war seemed to have come to an end, and the Red Army raised its flag over the ruins of Berlin with the cry of conquest. Victory, however, did not bring peace, but a dark outcome that stained the city streets with shadows of despair and cruelty. What began as celebrations among Soviet soldiers, with songs and dances echoing among the rubble, soon transformed into untamed chaos. Discipline vanished like smoke, and alcohol flowed unchecked, fueling a wave of looting and violence that no one could stop, as if they had suddenly forgotten they were human and not beasts. The political commissars tried to impose order, but their efforts were useless against an army intoxicated by triumph and intoxication. The first days of occupation seemed deceptively peaceful. Soviet soldiers were busy pursuing retreating German troops, and exhausted but hopeful Berliners took the opportunity to loot warehouses for food and fuel. They believed the worst was over. But on the fourth day, everything changed. The city, already devastated by bombing, descended into a hell no one had anticipated. Soldiers, now free from the restrictions of war, began breaking into homes, razing everything in their path. Resistance was futile. Those who attempted to resist were mercilessly slaughtered. Even German soldiers waving white flags in surrender were executed without hesitation. The violence escalated with each passing day, and Berlin became a scene of horror. Women, regardless of age or political affiliation, were the primary victims of this wave of brutality. Rape became the norm, committed in the street, among the ruins of buildings, or even in front of entire families. Drunken soldiers attacked without distinction, from young girls to old women. A German journalist named Margaret B. recorded this nightmare in her survival diary. On May 8, 1945, she wrote, "I rode a bicycle with a disheveled girl who had been a prisoner of the Russians for 14 days. She had been raped, but at least she was well fed. The usual rapes took place. A neighbor who tried to resist was shot. Mrs. Krauss was not raped. She insists that the Russians do not touch women who wear glasses. I would like to know if that is true." The troops were quite drunk, but at least they distinguished between young and old women. I suppose that is progress. Even those who initially welcomed the Soviets as liberators found themselves betrayed. Inga Dutron, who was hiding with her mother, recalled the thrill she felt upon hearing the approaching Soviet tanks. Believing the Nazi nightmare was over, she emerged from her shelter to greet them. But one of the soldiers approached her with a crooked smile, muttering, come on, madam, come on." Terrified, she ran back to her mother, who sighed. So it's true after all. Her hope that their Jewish identification would protect them vanished in an instant. The attacks were not limited to the streets. Soviet soldiers entered bunkers and basements where the Germans were sheltering from the fighting. There, rapes were committed in front of helpless witnesses, children, the elderly, husbands unable to intervene. In some cases, the women were selected according to the soldiers' preferences. In others, a group attack was simply carried out without any distinction. The first anti-fascist mayor of Charlottenburg described a bleak picture: massive looting, robberies in warehouses, shops and homes, and an endless wave of rapes. The only way to avoid being attacked was to remain hidden. In some neighborhoods, women began disguising themselves as old women or covering themselves with rags to avoid attracting attention, but these strategies didn't always work. A police report sent to the Soviet commander of Spandau revealed the full extent of the horror. In the early hours of May 6, 1945, 3 Russian soldiers broke into a building, smashed windows, and forced a tenant to open the door. They went up to the second floor and found 2 young women sleeping with a baby. They sat on the bed, lit cigarettes, and demanded that the women sleep with them. When one of them tried to scream, they threatened her with a gun. The other woman called for her mother, but a soldier dragged her into another room, restrained her with a machine gun, and looted her belongings. Meanwhile, the other two soldiers raped the woman left behind. This was not an isolated incident. Extreme violence became the order of the day for the women of Berlin, who, in addition to losing their homes and loved ones in the war, now had to face a hell that seemed endless. A petition from Berlin, signed by Rinnek Andorf on June 28, 1945, describes an attack that occurred on May 4th of that same year. In the incident, two drunken Russian soldiers attacked a married couple. The 62-year-old wife was raped by both soldiers, while her 66-year-old husband was shot dead. Later, a third Russian soldier broke into another apartment and raped the woman again. She, convinced that her husband had no Nazi affiliation, requested an audience with the commandant. Swiss journalist Max Schnetzer documented harrowing scenes in the Berlin residential district in his diaries. In one of the cases recounted, a father tried to protect his daughter, but Mongolian soldiers stabbed him in the stomach with a three-edged bayonet. Amid the chaos, dozens of women were lined up in front of the Russian soldiers, who, in their frenzy, didn't even notice that many of them were dying, either from poisoning or internal bleeding. Some women tried to defend themselves by biting and scratching, but were hit on the head with rifle butts. Meanwhile, the men who stood between the soldiers and the victims were immediately executed. However, not all Russian soldiers acted brutally. In some cases, they showed compassion. A Soviet officer stopped a family planning suicide after witnessing a mass rape, promising them protection. In another case, a group of soldiers was detained by their own comrades when they attempted to attack a girl in the presence of her father. The local mayor of Breslau wrote of the contradictions of the Russian occupation. One must have seen how a Russian soldier could give his last piece of bread to a German child, or how a Russian truck driver offered to take an old woman with his broken-down wagon. But also, one must have witnessed how those same men set up ambushes in cemeteries waiting to attack unaccompanied women or girls. The crudest description of the situation comes from the testimony of Junior Sergeant Ratkin, a Soviet army telephone operator. "I remember a German woman who had been raped. She was lying naked with a grenade between her legs. I'm ashamed of it now, but not back then. Feelings changed over time. In the early days, we had one kind of feeling, then another. After several months, 5 German girls came to our battalion crying. A gynecologist examined them. They had jagged wounds and their underwear was soaked in blood. They had been raped all night. We gathered our battalion and told them, 'Look at these men, and if you recognize any of them, we'll execute them on the spot.' But they just sat and cried. They didn't want any more blood, they said. Each one received a loaf of bread. Of course, all this is war. Do you think it was easy to forgive when you saw intact white houses with tiled roofs and roses in the gardens? I myself wanted to hurt them. I wanted to see their tears. It was impossible to suddenly become good, fair, and kind, as if nothing had happened. It would take years for that. Berlin, a city already destroyed by bombing and combat, became a living hell for its inhabitants. The arrival of the Red Army, which many had awaited in the hope that it would mean the end of the suffering, brought with it a new nightmare. And for women in particular, the war was not yet over. Occupied Berlin. The fall of Berlin in 1945 not only sealed the end of the war in Europe, but also unleashed a hell whose shadows fell upon those who lived through it. The city, already reduced to rubble by bombing and street fighting, was transformed into a nightmarish setting where fear and despair intertwined in grotesque ways. For German women, survival became a daily battle, not only against hunger and destruction, but also against a more immediate threat, the ruthless hunt by Soviet soldiers. Amid the chaos, many women resorted to desperate tactics to escape the invaders' gaze. Some covered their faces with ashes and earth, cut their hair, and wrapped themselves in loose clothing to conceal their femininity. Others feigned illnesses like typhus or venereal infections, knowing that even the most brutal men feared catching them. But the most common strategy was hiding. Cellars, makeshift shelters, and dark corners became temporary refuges where women huddled together, waiting for the danger to pass. Going out to search for food or water was a risky endeavor, and many did so in groups, trusting that strength in numbers would keep them safe. However, not all women could remain hidden. Some attempted to bargain with the soldiers, offering watches, jewelry, or even food in exchange for their safety. Occasionally, they appealed to the invaders' compassion, hoping that amidst so much destruction, a trace of humanity might still remain. But the reality was cruel. Sexual violence became a constant shadow, and many women were subjected to repeated abuse. In Berlin, it is estimated that at least 20,000 women were raped, although some sources put the figure at between 100,000 and 1 million, as many were attacked multiple times. It is estimated that as many as 10,000 women died as a result of these assaults. The brutality was not limited to Berlin. As Soviet troops advanced through Germany, violence spread like a plague. It is estimated that approximately 1.9 million German women were raped during and after the war. Children, the elderly, married and unmarried women, no one was safe. Fear settled in every corner, and survival became an act of resistance. In the midst of this hell, some women found ways to manipulate their fate. They sought the protection of higher-ranking officers, establishing relationships that, although born of desperation, offered them a measure of security. These alliances, often based on consensual sexual relations, not only protected the women but also served as a shield against lower-ranking soldiers, who were more likely to commit acts of violence. In some cases, these relationships gave rise to genuine feelings of affection, albeit always under the shadow of war. A harrowing account of this period is found in the diary of a woman in Berlin, written by an anonymous author. In its pages, she describes how, after suffering multiple rapes between April and May 1945, she decided to seek the protection of a Soviet officer. "I exclaimed aloud, 'Let it be!' and made a decision. I needed a powerful man, an officer who could protect me," she wrote. Her account reflects the harshness of those days where dignity was sacrificed for the sake of survival. Women also tried to take advantage of any connection with Soviet soldiers. Those who spoke Russian or were familiar with Soviet culture tried to use this to their advantage, establishing bonds that could deter violence. However, these strategies did not always work, and many ended up victims of abuse. The impact of sexual violence did not end with the assaults. Many women became pregnant, and the number of unwanted pregnancies was so high that the authorities were forced to intervene. In Berlin, special wards were set up to care for these women. In the Neukölln district, for example, a significant increase in abortion requests was recorded. Between June 7, 1945 and June 17, 1946, the Health Office approved 995 abortions due to rape. The testimonies presented to the authorities were harrowing. One woman, raped on April 7, 1945, stated that she already had an illegitimate child and lived with her parents, who cared for other young children. Another, attacked while en route to Potsdam, explained that she was single. Her mother had died 15 years earlier, and she had no contact with her father, who was of Jewish descent. "Given my circumstances, it is impossible for me to bring a child into the world," she stated. Another case, dated August 8, 1945, tells the story of a woman raped by a Mongolian soldier while on her way to work during Passover. "I cannot consider carrying this pregnancy to term," she wrote. "It would be my death, and my children would be orphaned." The spread of venereal diseases was also a serious problem. Doctors like Anari Durand-Weber, who worked at a first aid post in Berlin, examined women and girls for these infections and performed the necessary abortions. Durand-Weber documented that rape, unwanted pregnancies, and mass abortions continued well into 1946. The legacy of this campaign of violence is indelible. The physical and emotional scars endured for the survivors, and the trauma was passed on to subsequent generations. The records from Neukölln and other health offices bear silent testimony to the suffering these women endured. But what drove Soviet soldiers to commit such atrocities? What transforms a human being into a perpetrator of such brutal crimes? To understand, it is necessary to look beyond the facts and explore the context that preceded these acts. War not only destroys cities, but also the humanity of those who wage it. And in Berlin, that destruction reached its darkest point. Although not all men in uniform acted with the same brutality, some harbored a glimmer of humanity within them, as Dora Nass recounts in one of her conversations. She spoke with a rawness that chilled the blood about things many preferred to forget. He recalled how Hitler and his men rose to power, how war broke out, and how he watched Berlin go up in flames. With a sincerity that cut like a sharp blade, he described the Soviet soldiers. It was in those days, after the fall of the Third Reich, that he had first seen them and shared with them the first moments of a defeated city. One of those men left a mark on his life that time could not erase. If he had to sum up that encounter in 2 words, they would be mistake and astonishment. It was the spring of 1945. Soviet soldiers were advancing toward the outskirts of Berlin. On April 28th, Dora still hunkered down in a bunker, listening to the roar of cannon fire and rumors that the Wehrmacht was regrouping in the north to drive out the invaders. She wanted it desperately. Fear of the Russians consumed her, a fear fueled by years of propaganda painting the Bolsheviks as savage hordes. But the Wehrmacht failed to regroup. The German army crumbled under the weight of the Soviet offensive, and Hitler's fantasies vanished into thin air. Berlin had fallen. The Germans were faced with the task of picking up the pieces of their shattered nation. Amid the ruins, smoke and fire, Dora felt lost, as if the world she knew had vanished. On May 3rd, she saw a Soviet soldier for the first time. A vehicle appeared in the distance, and there was no doubt they were Russians. Terror paralyzed her. When the car stopped and a soldier approached, she expected the worst. But to her surprise, the man spoke in impeccable German. His name was Boris. He sat down next to her and they began to talk. He showed her photos of his family, and she shyly did the same. For 3 days, Boris lived in the house where she was sheltering. He placed a sign on the door that read, "Occupied by tankers, protecting them from eviction." Without that sign, they could have lost everything, even their lives. That encounter, Dora remembered, was a glimmer of humanity in the darkness. "I could see a real person," she confessed, but there was no romance between them. "It was impossible to even think about him in that hell," she said. "The only thing that mattered was survival." Not all soldiers were like Boris. Dora also remembered an episode that left a lasting impression on her. One day, while walking through Berlin, a Soviet soldier snatched her bag and right in front of her eyes urinated on it. It wasn't a fairy tale, it was war. In an army of millions, there were men of all kinds. Over time, Dora learned of the horrors German soldiers had committed in the Soviet Union. She understood that, for many Russian women, an encounter with a Reich soldier didn't end with a ruined purse. Her memories were raw, unvarnished. She didn't try to justify herself or pretend she didn't see anything. She acknowledged that between 1933 and 1944, the war hadn't directly affected her. Like thousands of Germans, she waved swastika flags, listened fervently to speeches by Hitler and Goebbels, and celebrated Mussolini's visit to Berlin. They admired Hitler, seeing him as a leader respected throughout Europe. She also remembered how her neighbors disappeared without explanation, but she accepted the official version that they were sent to labor camps. She never imagined the existence of extermination camps. Like many others, she went to the cinema to watch anti-Semitic films without question. During the war, she lived with her family in a vacated house in Poland, never wondering what had happened to its owners. Only when the war reached German borders did she begin to understand the reality. Today, Dora asks herself, what could we have done? She and her generation were swept up in propaganda and nationalist fervor. That's why her testimony about Boris carries even more weight. Despite having grown up with the idea of German supremacy, she discovered that there were real people in the East too, men like Boris Abdulguzin. Boris stayed at Dora's house until May 9th, then he left. For years she searched for him. She sent letters to Moscow and even to the Central Committee, but never received a reply. It wasn't until 2010, with the help of a German journalist, that she finally discovered the truth. Boris was originally from Bashkiria, and his real name was Abdulguzin. After the war, he returned to his home village, where he died in 1984. Abdulguzin's granddaughter, Guzalia Abdulkadirova, and Dora exchanged letters and later met in person. Guzalia told her that her grandfather spoke a lot about her and had even encouraged his children to learn German. Dora's childhood and youth were spent under the Nazi regime, which shaped her worldview. But the Soviet soldier Boris Abdulguzin left a mark on her that time could not erase. His memory remained intact, like a beacon in the darkness. Today, Dora is no longer afraid to speak out. The Berlin Wall fell long ago. In a Europe where anti-Russian statements are fashionable, she could say whatever she wanted, but her testimony remains the same. For me, the victory of 1945 was a liberation. They liberated us, the Germans. Her words are valuable because they are born from reflection on the past and the present. Many insist on portraying Soviet soldiers as cruel and inhuman. But for Dora, the Soviet soldier was an honorable warrior, a just man. Bakhtiar Abdulkadirova, the soldier's granddaughter, also wanted to know the truth. She needed justice. Because in the end, the Soviet soldier just wanted to return home after a devastating war. There, in his home, they were waiting for him. Yanovska concentration camp. In the sweltering summer of 1944, when the Red Army stormed into the Yanovska prisoner of war camp in Ukraine, they found no survivors awaiting liberation. What they found was a pit of despair and death. Twisted bodies lay in shallow trenches, barely hidden by a layer of sand that the wind effortlessly stirred. Rot permeated the air, attracting swarms of flies that danced over the corpses like harbingers of unspeakable tragedy. Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of fighting and massacres, were paralyzed by the scale of the horror. Men and women with their hands tied behind their backs, holes drilled into their skulls, and faces frozen in a rictus of terror were all that remained of the prisoners. Strands of hair scattered on the ground suggested the cruel fate of many women before their execution. The barbarity knew no bounds. The few human shadows still breathing within the camp babbled stories of torment and suffering. In later archives, testimonies were recorded that spoke of the sadism of the camp commandant, a man whose wife shared his taste for death. It was said that both found amusement in shooting prisoners, in throwing children into the air only to strike them down before they hit the ground. Ruthlessness was the law at Yanovska, where life was extinguished with the indifference of extinguishing a candle. Images of this hell soon became fuel for Soviet propaganda. It wasn't just about informing, but about fueling hatred, igniting a thirst for revenge that would drive the troops to show no mercy. Posters, speeches, and radio broadcasts all repeated a single message: punishment for those who had committed these crimes. It didn't matter whether those directly responsible had fled or whether the victims of the reprisal were mere civilians. The blame fell on everyone. As the Red Army advanced westward, the brutality of the Nazi occupation was exposed in every abandoned village. Soviet soldiers found not only mass graves but also captive compatriots, young people whose faces, scarred by hunger and abuse, were enough to fuel bitterness. Pleas for justice lingered in the air, but the response was uncontrolled retaliation. When Soviet troops crossed the German border and entered East Prussia, the scene changed dramatically. There were no longer any traces of war in the German villages. Their intact houses and well-tended gardens stood in stark contrast to the smoldering ruins of the Soviet villages, devastated by the Nazi occupation. In the soldiers' eyes, this apparent normality was nothing more than a mockery, evidence that the suffering had been one-sided. To them, they were not entering neutral territory, but the home of those who had permitted and encouraged barbarism on their land. Discipline crumbled under the weight of resentment. Soviet commanders not only permitted acts of revenge, they encouraged them. On the streets of Prussia, violence became routine, with looting, murder, and abuse multiplying every day, without restraint, without trial, without remorse. It was not just a settling of scores, but the manifestation of fury pent up over years of humiliation and death. Alcohol flowed freely among the ranks of the Red Army, fueling the soldiers' ferocity. Intoxication not only loosened their inhibitions but also allowed them to justify them. The war had broken their humanity, turning them into instruments of destruction beyond redemption. The law of the mightiest ruled the knights in the occupied cities, and the enemy was not just the defeated soldier, but anyone who bore the stigma of having been born in the enemy nation. Official propaganda never acknowledged these crimes. For the Soviet leadership, the image of the Red Army had to remain unblemished. The narrative of the liberating soldier, the righteous avenger who carried with him the promise of a Europe free from the fascist yoke, was insisted upon. Reports of abuse were dismissed as lies concocted by those seeking to tarnish the glory of victory. However, on the ground, the reality was different. There were attempts to impose justice, but they were sporadic and limited. Some soldiers were tried and punished, sometimes with extreme sentences, not out of a true sense of reparation, but to avoid discredit. There were cases in which officers forced victims to identify their attackers, which often meant reliving the horror without any guarantee of real punishment. Most women chose silence, resigned to a war that offered them nothing but suffering. In some detachments, internal violence emerged as a form of regulation. Some soldiers, disgusted by the behavior of their own comrades, imposed their own version of justice. But these cases were the exception, not the norm. The chaos of the conflict allowed impunity to prevail, allowing the horrors to continue unpunished. World War II, on its Eastern Front, was not just a military confrontation, but a spectacle of absolute dehumanization. At the intersection of total war and unbridled revenge, notions of morality were shattered. Brutality begot more brutality, in a cycle of destruction that did not end with the fall of Berlin. For many, the war devastated not only their homeland, but also their souls. And when the gunfire ceased and peace was proclaimed, the echoes of barbarism continued to resonate, trapped in the memories of those who could never fully escape the hell they witnessed. After the war's end, the air in the Soviet-occupied territories became heavy, laden with a silence that hid muffled screams. The area, once vibrant with daily life, now lay under a shadow that seemed unremitting. With increasing reports of atrocities besmirching the name of the Red Army, authorities were forced to act, though their efforts were often lost in the fog of despair and chaos. In late 1945, the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet toughened penalties for rape, establishing sentences of 10 to 15 years in labor camps, places where cold and hunger were the only constant companions. High-ranking officers received strict orders to enforce discipline and show respect toward the German population, but words and actions rarely matched in those dark days. Some commanders, in an attempt to maintain control, resorted to extreme measures. There were cases where rapists were executed in front of their own units, their bodies hanging as macabre reminders of what awaited those who crossed the line. These public executions, though brutal, sought to send a clear message. Such acts would not be tolerated. Yet fear was not always enough to contain the bestiality the war had unleashed. Soviet propaganda, for its part, attempted to instill a sense of honor among soldiers, reminding them of their duty to protect civilians and defend the principles of socialism. But words printed in pamphlets and speeches could not erase the horror that had already been sown. To reduce opportunities for crime, drastic measures were implemented. Soldiers were transferred from German homes to military barracks, and entire villages were evacuated to create buffer zones. Soldiers required written authorization from their superiors to visit German homes, and any unauthorized incursion was severely punished. These measures, although well-intentioned, did not always achieve their objective. In practice, discipline was erratic. Some commanders turned a blind eye, while others stood helpless in the face of the chaos that reigned in the streets and fields of the post-war period. Alcohol, ever present in the trenches and camps, became a silent accomplice to violence. Drunkenness was a recurring factor in reports of assaults, and although the authorities attempted to control its consumption, the availability of alcoholic beverages and the lack of effective supervision exacerbated the problem. Empty bottles piled up on street corners, silent witnesses to the atrocities committed under its influence. But the suffering was not limited to Germany. As the Red Army advanced, it left a trail of pain in its wake. In Hungary, Romania, and other Allied territories of the Third Reich, women also fell victim to the violence unleashed. Even in Yugoslavia, an Allied country, Soviet soldiers did not hesitate to commit crimes. In late 1944 and early 1945, as troops advanced through northern Yugoslavia, rape and other acts of violence became a daily reality for many families. Although the number of victims was lower compared to Germany, the pain was just as profound. Josip Broz Tito, the Yugoslav leader, did not remain silent. He filed multiple complaints with Soviet commanders, demanding justice for his people. In response, some soldiers were severely punished, sent to labor camps, or publicly executed. However, not all of the guilty parties faced justice. Many continued on their way, leaving behind a trail of tears and scars that would never fully heal. Soviet propaganda attempted to shape soldiers' behavior, but words could not erase actions. In Yugoslavia, emphasis was placed on the fight against the Germans and the heroism of local partisans. Soldiers were urged to respect Yugoslav traditions and laws, but for many women, these words came too late. The damage had already been done, and fear had taken root in their hearts. The use of rape as a weapon of war was not exclusive to the Soviets. On the Western Front, soldiers from the United States, Great Britain, and France also committed similar atrocities. In France, after the Normandy landings, women became easy targets for American soldiers. Propaganda fueled the idea that French women were sexually accessible, a narrative that justified countless abuses. Although the US Army Command attempted to blame African American soldiers, the violence continued, spreading to Germany after its occupation. Natalia Gesser, a witness of those times, recounted how women of all ages, from 8-year-old girls to 80-year-old women, suffered at the hands of the soldiers. Her words paint a harrowing picture of a world where humanity seemed to have been lost in the heat of war. On the other hand, Vsevolod Olimpiev, a Russian veteran, offered a different perspective, stating that his regiment maintained a neutral attitude toward the German population, even sharing food with needy families. However, his words contrast with the accounts of other soldiers who admitted to participating in acts of violence that now seemed inexplicable to them. "We were young, strong, and we had been without women for 4 years," one confessed. "We tried fishing for German women. 10 men raped 1 girl. There weren't enough women. The entire population was fleeing the Red Army. So we took girls of 12 or 13. If she cried, we put something in her mouth. We thought it was funny. Now I can't understand how we were able to do it. A boy from a good family, but that was me." These words, laden with remorse, reflect the duality of a conflict that dehumanized both victims and perpetrators. The war not only destroyed cities and borders, but also eroded morality and compassion, leaving behind a legacy of pain that still resonates in the darkest corners of Europe. In April 1945, as World War II drew to a close in Europe, Allied troops advanced on a devastated continent. However, amid the rubble and despair, another kind of horror emerged: systematic sexual violence. The euphoria of victory soon turned into a nightmare for thousands of women who, after surviving the war, became victims of a brutality rarely mentioned in official accounts. The American forces, in particular, left a trail of crimes that official records barely reflect. In just 1 month, April 1945, 37 convictions for sexual assault committed by American soldiers were documented. However, this figure is only the tip of the iceberg. According to later studies, it is estimated that at least 14,000 women in Western Europe were raped by American soldiers, most of them on German soil. The victims ranged from 7-year-old girls to 69-year-old women, many of whom were subjected to acts of unspeakable cruelty. US military reports documented these incidents, but for the most part, the perpetrators faced few or no consequences. The perception of superiority over a defeated population, coupled with the chaos at the end of the war, created an environment where abuse was an extension of the conflict. These acts were justified with the argument that German women consented, a claim contradicted by countless testimonies. The British, although on a smaller scale, were also involved. Although discipline within their ranks was stricter, cases of sexual assault were reported, and, as with the Americans, many went unpunished. Some soldiers saw the German population as a means of redress for the horrors their own people had suffered during the war years. In a twisted sense of justice, revenge was directed at women, who became symbols of an already defeated enemy. The case of the French troops was equally disturbing. In the areas under their control, sexual violence reached alarming levels. In Stuttgart, after the French occupation in April 1945, hundreds of cases were reported in a short period of time. The colonial soldiers from North and West Africa were used as scapegoats by their superiors, who blamed them for most of the crimes. However, this narrative was largely a strategy to shift blame away from the French troops as a whole. The indifference of the military authorities was evident, and efforts to punish the perpetrators were minimal. For many of these soldiers, German women were seen as part of the spoils of war, an idea reinforced by years of propaganda and speeches that dehumanized the enemy. This dark episode in history has been obscured by the traditional narrative of World War II. It has been insisted that only the Red Army carried out these atrocities, but the reality is that sexual violence was present on all sides. Impunity, chaos, and lack of control allowed thousands of women to be violated without hope of justice. For many, the end of the war did not bring peace, but rather a prolongation of suffering, leaving scars that would last for generations. Nazi propaganda exploited these events to stoke resentment, but the truth is that these crimes were not exclusive to a single faction. Abuse and humiliation became weapons, used by the victors with the same contempt with which the enemy had previously used them. While history was written with the ink of the victors, the pain of the victims was relegated to the margins of the archives, a shadow that few dare to illuminate: the arrival of the Soviets. The fear of the arrival of the Soviets spread like a cold, heavy shadow over Germany. The Nazis had sown warnings about the advancing Red Army, painting a future of ruin, death, and horrors beyond all imagination. As Soviet troops crossed the borders, many German families hung white flags in their windows, symbols of surrender and despair. But there was no resistance. The war had left men dead, missing at the front, or too young or old to bear arms. Only women, children, and the elderly remained, trapped in a crumbling country. Fear of violence, particularly rape, spread like wildfire. Terrified women avoided hospitals even after being assaulted. Although the Soviets established medical centers to treat venereal diseases, few dared to go. Rumors circulated that these places were traps used to identify victims and send them to forced labor in Siberia. Some said the treatment in these centers was worse than the diseases themselves. The terror was so profound that many chose to suffer in silence rather than risk falling into the hands of those who had harmed them. Organized resistance was almost non-existent. The war had exhausted the population, and with the fall of the Nazi regime in May 1945, there was nothing left to fight for. Furthermore, Soviet forces, especially the NKVD, acted with brutal efficiency to crush any sign of opposition. They carried out mass arrests, detaining anyone who seemed hostile to the new order. Many Germans, however, harbored the hope that a war between the Soviets and the Western powers would soon break out, freeing them from the communist yoke. This belief, known as the war myth, gave them a glimmer of hope, but it also paralyzed them, waiting for a salvation that never came. The fear of violence transformed daily life. Women stopped going out alone, especially at night, and took desperate measures to protect themselves. Some abandoned their homes, while others, in an act of desperation, chose suicide rather than confront the abuse. The sense of insecurity took root in every corner of the communities, creating an atmosphere of constant terror. But the damage was not limited to the physical. The rapes left deep scars on the victims, who carried feelings of shame, guilt, and fear. Social stigma silenced them, trapping them in solitary pain. Many were rejected by their communities and even their own families, which compounded their suffering. The fear of marginalization prevented them from seeking help or sharing their stories. The children born from these rapes also suffered. They were labeled illegitimate, faced social rejection, and in some cases were abandoned or handed over to the state. Their mothers bore immense social pressure, and the children themselves grew up with the weight of their origins, unable to find a true sense of belonging. The trauma affected not only the women, but also their families. Husbands, fathers, and brothers felt powerless in their inability to protect their loved ones, generating feelings of hopelessness and anger. The breakdown of traditional family roles, which in Nazi society were based on the idea that men should be the protectors, created a sense of failure among them. This family crisis had lasting repercussions, affecting the German social structure for decades. Distrust extended not only toward Soviet soldiers, but also toward neighbors. The sense of isolation grew, eroding the sense of mutual support that had been vital to survival during the war. The rapes not only left individual damage, but also marked German national identity. For many, the violence suffered at the hands of the Soviets was perceived as collective punishment for the crimes of the Nazi regime. This sense of victimhood created a complex and conflicting identity in German society, where guilt and shame for the horrors committed coexisted with resentment toward the occupiers. For decades, this duality influenced Germany's relations with the Soviet Union and its reconstruction as a nation. Today, most of the victims of these widespread rapes are deceased. However, History remembers the fall of Berlin in 1945 as a moment of glory, the end of Nazism and the victory of the Allies. But among the rubble of that victory remained the voices of thousands of women who endured unimaginable suffering, a lesser-known and often silenced chapter of World War II. Their stories, buried under the weight of stigma and oblivion, are a reminder that war destroys not only cities, but also souls.